The valley below the city of Uxellodunum belonged to the defenders. It was steep, it was defensible, and it held the one thing that no siege could ever take away by force: water. A single spring, fed from deep inside the limestone hill, poured cool and endless into the fortress above, and as long as it flowed, the 8,000 Gauls sheltered behind those walls believed they could outlast Rome itself. In the summer of 51 BC, they were almost certainly right. And then Julius Caesar looked at that spring, and he did something no besieging army had ever thought to attempt. He decided to make the water climb uphill and disappear. How do you take a river away from a city that sits on top of it? How do you defeat a fortress not by breaking its walls, but by convincing the earth itself to stop giving up its water? That is the question the men of Uxellodunum could not answer in time. And by the time they understood what the Romans were building in the ravine below them, the spring they had trusted for generations was already dying. Here is what I am going to walk you through. First, why Uxellodunum was considered one of the most unconquerable positions in all of Gaul, a fortress so naturally defended that Caesar's own officers hesitated to assault it. Second, the exact reason a direct attack was suicide, and why the two Gallic commanders inside chose this specific hill to make the final stand of the entire Gallic War. Third, the strange twin project Caesar ordered his engineers to build, one part of it in plain sight as a decoy, and one part of it hidden underground where no defender could see it. Fourth, the precise engineering trick, the tunnels and the galleries driven straight into the hillside that let Rome drain a spring the Gauls thought was untouchable. And fifth, the moment the water failed, and why the defenders read that silence not as Roman engineering, but as a sign that their own gods had abandoned them. I should say plainly what I am and what I am not. I am not a classicist, and I am not an archaeologist. What follows is drawn largely from Caesar's own account of the Gallic War, and specifically from its 8th and final book, which Caesar himself did not write. That book was composed by his officer, Aulus Hirtius, a man who served on Caesar's staff, who later rose to the consulship of Rome in 43 BC, and who died in battle at Mutina within months of taking office. Hirtius tells us in his own preface, in a letter to a friend named Balbus, that he took up the task reluctantly, to bridge the gap between Caesar's 7 books and the civil war that followed. So our main source for Uxellodunum is a loyal subordinate writing after his commander's assassination, filling in a story his commander chose not to tell himself. Ancient sources exaggerate, and Caesar's camp in particular was writing to justify itself to Rome. So take the numbers as the ancient record gives them, and understand that where the sources are thin, I will tell you so. Where we can check the text against the ground itself, though, something remarkable happens. And I will come to that, because this is one of the rare ancient sieges where archaeologists have actually pulled the arrowheads out of the earth exactly where the story says they should be. To understand why this siege mattered, you have to understand what year it was. By 51 BC, the Great Gallic Revolt was already broken. The year before, at Alesia, Caesar had trapped the war leader Vercingetorix and roughly 80,000 fighting men inside the town, and then done something that still reads like fiction. He built a double ring of fortifications, an inner wall of about 11 Roman miles facing the town to keep the defenders in, and an outer wall of about 14 miles facing away from it to keep the relief army out, complete with towers, trenches, buried stakes, and fields of iron spikes his soldiers grimly nicknamed after flowers and thorns. The relief force that came to break that ring was, by the ancient count, 250,000 men, and it failed. Vercingetorix rode out of the gates, laid his weapons at Caesar's feet, and the organized resistance of a whole country effectively died on that field. Most of Gaul went quiet, but quiet is not the same as conquered, and Caesar knew it, which is why he spent 51 BC not resting, but methodically stamping out every ember, campaigning against the Bituriges, the Carnutes, the Bellovaci, one after another. And in the southwest, among the people the Romans called the Cadurci, in the rough limestone country of what is now the Lot region of France, 2 commanders refused to accept that the war was over. One was named Drop, and he was not even a local man. He was a Senonian from far to the northeast, and Hirtius tells us he had spent the war gathering a following of desperate men, outlaws, escaped slaves, exiles, and deserters, and using them to raid Roman supply lines. The other was Lucterius, and he was the opposite kind of soldier. He was a Cadurcan, a man of this exact country, and he had been one of Vercingetorix's most trusted lieutenants, the officer sent early in the Great Revolt to threaten the Roman province itself in the south. Hirtius calls him a man of the utmost daring. After Alesia, these two joined forces with perhaps 2,000 of the most committed fighters left in Gaul, and when a Roman legate named Gaius Caninius Rebellus came after them with 2 legions, they did not scatter. They looked for a place where a small, determined force could hold out against the most effective army in the world. And Lucterius, the local man, knew exactly where that place was, because his own people had trusted it for generations. They chose Uxellodunum. The name itself tells you what it was. In the Gaulish language, it means something very close to high fort. And you can understand the choice the moment you see the ground. For centuries, scholars argued about where Uxellodunum actually stood, and the question was considered important enough that the Emperor Napoleon III, who was writing his own history of Julius Caesar in the 1860s, sponsored excavations to settle it. His investigator, a local scholar named Jean-Baptiste Cessac, dug at a plateau called the Puy de Salude, above the Dordogne River near the town of Vayrac in 1865, and began pulling Roman iron out of the slope by the spring. More than a century later, from the 1990s into the 2000s, the archaeologist Jean-Pierre Giraud led modern excavations at the same spot, a spring on the hillside called the Fontaine de Lullier, and recovered hundreds of artifacts, arrowheads, catapult bolts, burned timber, exactly the debris you would expect from a savage fight over a water source in the middle of the 1st century BC. In 2001, the French Ministry of Culture officially recognized the Puy de Salude as the site of the siege. So when I describe this place, I am not describing a guess. The plateau covers dozens of hectares and stands roughly 100 meters above the valley floor, ringed by cliffs that fall away sharp on nearly every side, with the water curling around its base. There was one approach where the ground was less impossible, and that approach was narrow, exposed, and easily defended by a handful of men. Caninius looked at it with his 2 legions and did not even attempt an assault. He built 3 separate fortified camps on the high ground around it and settled in. An attacking army could not surround the hill in the ordinary way and simply starve it, because the defenders had done what defenders in that age rarely managed to do completely. They had stockpiled grain. Drop and Lucterius had led foraging expeditions out through the Roman lines specifically to gather enough food to outlast a very long siege. And here the story takes its first dark turn, because one of those expeditions is where the leadership of the defense began to die. Caninius caught one of the grain convoys on its way back, fell on it at night, and destroyed it, and in the fighting that followed, Drop himself was taken prisoner. Lucterius, cut off from the town, fled rather than fight his way back in. So the 2,000 men inside the walls, plus the townspeople sheltering with them, were now holding the strongest position in Gaul, well-fed, well-armed, and leaderless. But they held anyway, because they had the one advantage that made every other number irrelevant. They had water that no army could cut off, because it came from inside their own hill. That last point is the whole story. Water is the thing that decides sieges, and every commander in the ancient world knew it. An army can carry grain, can forage, can wait. A human being can survive weeks without food, but a city without water dies in days, and the death is not quiet. Thirst breaks discipline before it breaks bodies. It is why the great siege engineers of history so often attacked the water first. When Cyrus the Great took Babylon in 539 BC, the story Herodotus tells is not of a storm of the walls, but of engineers diverting the Euphrates itself, lowering the river until his soldiers could wade in along the channel. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib marched on Jerusalem, King Hezekiah's response, recorded in scripture and confirmed by a tunnel you can still walk through today, was to cut a channel through 500 meters of solid rock to bring his spring inside the walls, precisely because he knew what happens to a city whose water lies outside them. Every commander who has ever stood outside a fortress has understood that the fastest way in is to find the well and take it. At Uxellodunum, there was no well to take. There was a spring welling up on the slope below the town at the Fontaine de Loulier, fed from deep inside the plateau, and the defenders could reach it under the cover of their walls and the steepness of the ground. As long as that spring ran, the arithmetic of the siege favored the Gauls, not Rome. And then Caesar arrived, and he arrived in a way designed to unsettle. Hirtius tells us he left the bulk of his army behind and rode ahead with only cavalry, appearing outside Uxellodunum suddenly before anyone believed he could be there. He had a specific political reason for coming in person. His command in Gaul was nearing its legal end. His enemies in the Senate were sharpening their knives, and he understood that if this one hilltop was seen to defy Rome successfully, every tribe in Gaul would remember it the moment his legions marched away. This siege was not about 2,000 men. It was about whether 8 years of conquest would hold. And when he studied the ground, he understood immediately that he was looking at a problem no battering ram could solve. The town could not be starved. The walls could not be cheaply stormed. So he made the decision that defines this whole story. Hirtius records it almost casually. Caesar determined that the defenders must be cut off from their water. To see how, you have to picture the ground the way his engineers saw it. The town on its plateau. The river curling around the base, close enough that the defenders had used it freely until Roman archers and slingers were posted along the banks. And artillery, the torsion-powered bolt throwers the Romans called scorpions, was ranged on every path down to the riverbank. That closed the river. Any Gaul who went down to it died on the way, which left the spring, rising in a ravine on the slope below the town wall, reachable by a steep, protected path. Caesar pushed his men forward to contest that path, and the defenders fought him for it with everything they had, because both sides understood exactly what was at stake. The fighting over the spring was brutal, and it was constant, and the archaeology confirms it, because that hillside is precisely where the excavations found their densest concentrations of Roman arrowheads and bolt heads, hundreds of iron points buried in a few dozen meters of slope, and it settled nothing. Because even where the Romans pressed close, the Gauls could still reach the water under the covering fire of their own men on the heights. That is the moment the siege turned from a contest of arms into a contest of engineering. Caesar could not take the water by fighting for it, so he decided he would take it another way. He ordered 2 things built at once, and the genius of the plan is that the 2 projects were meant to be understood differently by the enemy watching from the walls. The first project was visible, deliberate, and enormous. Facing the spring, his men began raising a siege terrace, an agger, a great ramp of earth and timber pushed forward under the protection of covered galleries the Romans called vanii, mobile sheds roofed with hides and wicker that let workers advance under fire. Hirtius gives us the dimensions. The ramp rose 60 feet, and on top of it the engineers erected a tower of 10 stories, not tall enough to overtop the town on its plateau, which no tower could, but tall enough to overlook the spring itself and rake its approaches with missiles. Think about what 60 feet of engineered earthwork means. It means thousands of men digging, hauling, laying timber cribbing day after day in full view and in easy range of the enemy. To the defenders above, this looked like the whole of the Roman effort. It looked like Caesar meant to seize the spring directly, to build his way physically on top of it, and so the Gauls concentrated their attention and their attacks on that terrace. Hirtius describes the counterattack in detail. They filled barrels with tallow, pitch, and dry shingles of wood, set them alight, and rolled them blazing down the steep slope onto the Roman works, following behind in a mass assault so that the Romans would be too busy fighting to put out the fires. The flames caught. The galleries and the timberwork began to burn, and the fight on that burning slope was as desperate as anything in the whole Gallic war, because the Romans were battling uphill, against fire and gravity and men above them, to save a structure that, and this is the extraordinary part, was not even the real weapon. Caesar himself broke the crisis with theater. He sent cohorts scrambling up the cliffs on the far side of the town, and had his men everywhere raise a sudden shout, as if a general assault on the walls was beginning. The defenders, terrified for their families behind them, broke off the attack on the terrace and rushed back to the ramparts. The fires were put out. The towers stood. They could not see the second project, because the second project was underground. While the terrace climbed in full view, Caesar had his engineers begin driving tunnels, caniculi in Latin, into the hillside, working from behind the shelter of the siege works toward the hidden source that fed the spring. Hirtius says it plainly. The work could be done, this time, without being observed and even without being suspected. And this is the part that separates Roman siegecraft from almost everyone else's in the ancient world, because Rome did not improvise this skill on the spot. Tunneling was in the army's institutional memory going back centuries. The Roman tradition held that Veii, Rome's great Etruscan rival, fell in 396 BC to a tunnel driven under its walls. Roman contractors ran deep galleries through the silver mountains of Spain, draining them with water wheels and channels. And above all, Rome was already a civilization of hydraulic engineers. The city itself had been drinking from aqueducts since 312 BC, and the men who built aqueducts understood something most ancient people never had reason to articulate. A spring is not a gift that appears from nowhere. A spring is the visible end of a hidden system. Here is the actual mechanism, and it matters, because the whole trick depends on it. The plateau of Uxellodunum is limestone, and limestone country, what geologists today call karst, behaves in a very particular way. Rainwater falling on the plateau absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and the soil and becomes weakly acidic, carbonic acid. And over thousands of years, that acid dissolves the calcium carbonate of the rock along its joints and fractures, widening hairline cracks into channels, channels into conduits. Water in karst does not seep evenly through the hill like water through a sponge. It runs in discrete underground veins, concentrated flows following the dissolved fracture network, gathering from a wide catchment on the plateau above, and converging until they break the surface at the one point where the geometry lets them out. That point was the Fontaine de Lullier, which means the spring the Gauls were defending was only a mouth. The body of the water lay inside the hill, in a branching system of feeder channels, and every one of those channels passed through rock that no defender was watching, because no defender imagined it could be attacked. If water travels through the rock to reach the surface at one point, then a patient enough tunneler, digging into the hillside above and behind that point, can find those hidden veins and cut them, one by one, and bleed the source dry before the water ever reaches the mouth of the spring. That is what they did. Screened by the noise and the smoke and the violence of the fight over the visible terrace, Roman miners drove their galleries into the slope, following the wet rock, listening for flowing water the way miners have always listened, and intercepting the feeder channels one after another. Every vein they cut was diverted into their own workings and carried away downhill, water that would never again reach the surface where the Gauls came to drink. Understand the choreography here, because it is the heart of the plan. The terrace, the tower, the burning barrels, the assaults, all of that violence had a second function beyond the fighting itself. It was cover. Miners make noise. Picks ring on stone, spoil has to be hauled out and dumped, and in quiet conditions a defender pressing an ear to the ground can hear tunneling, a danger every ancient siege manual warned about. But no one can hear picks under a battle. The Gauls spent their strength and their attention on the thing Caesar showed them, while the thing that would actually kill their city advanced in silence a few dozen feet inside the rock. The Romans were not draining the spring from the front where the defenders were watching. They were reaching over the top of it into the body of the hill and turning the water away before it could ever emerge. In effect, they were pulling the river backward, up and out of the hillside, and making it flow into Roman ditches instead of into Gallic waterskins. For the defenders, the first sign of catastrophe would not have looked like an attack at all. It would have looked like a betrayal by the earth. The spring, which had run strong and steady through the entire siege, through living memory, through the memory of their grandfathers, began to falter. The flow thinned. The water that had gushed now trickled, and it was high summer, when thirst is sharpest and every remaining cup matters most. And then the trickle failed, and then the source that had fed their town for as long as anyone could remember simply stopped. There was no breach in the wall. No Roman had reached the water. It had, from where they stood, dried up on its own in the middle of a siege. At the exact moment they needed it most. Now put yourself inside those walls. You have food, months of it, gathered at the cost of your commander's freedom. You have your weapons. You have driven back every Roman assault, burned their siege works, watched their soldiers die on your slopes. By the logic of the war you have fought your whole life, you are winning. And then the water dies for no reason your eyes can explain. Hirtius records exactly how they interpreted it, and his phrasing is precise. They believed the drying of the spring had happened not by the design of men, but by the will of the gods. And you should not hear that as simple superstition, because within their understanding of the world, it was the most rational conclusion available. The Gauls held springs sacred. Across Gaul, archaeologists have found spring sanctuaries heaped with offerings, carved wooden figures, coins, weapons given to the water, because a spring was understood as a living point of contact between the human world and the divine one. Nothing in anyone's experience suggested that a spring could be murdered. Springs outlasted kingdoms, so when theirs died with no visible cause, the defenders reached for the only explanation their world supplied. The divine powers themselves had turned against Uxellodunum, had withdrawn the gift, and no courage of theirs could stand against that. It was not the loss of the water alone that broke them. It was the meaning they read into it. Men who will fight an army to the last will not fight their own gods, and the moment they decided the heavens had abandoned the hill was already lost. That is the strange, quiet horror of this siege. Caesar did not need to storm the walls. He did not need to starve them over a winter. He turned their own certainty against them, took the one resource they had counted as untouchable, and let the terror of the inexplicable do the rest. And notice the asymmetry, because it is almost a law of siege warfare. A defender who loses a wall knows he was beaten by men, and beaten men can surrender with honor or fight on in hope. A defender who believes he was beaten by heaven has nothing left to negotiate with and nothing left to hope for. The garrison came down and surrendered, because a fortress that cannot drink cannot stand, and a garrison that believes it is cursed will not even try. What Caesar did next belongs to the record too, and it is not gentle. He was determined that Uxellodunum be the last place in Gaul that ever thought of resistance. And Hirtius, remember, a man writing in praise of his commander, reports the decision without flinching. Caesar ordered the hands cut off of every man who had borne arms against him, and let them live, mutilated, dispersed as a walking warning to every other tribe in Gaul. Hirtius even preserves the reasoning. Their lives were spared precisely so that the punishment would be the more conspicuous, so that everywhere a survivor of Uxellodunum begged or was fed by others, the lesson would be visible. It is worth being honest about where this sat in Caesar's range. This was a man who cultivated a reputation for clemency and often earned it, but who had also, 2 years earlier at Avaricum, permitted a sack in which the ancient account claims nearly 40,000 died, and whose 8 years in Gaul, by the figures Plutarch gives, killed 1 million people and enslaved 1 million more. Numbers ancient even by ancient standards, numbers that Pliny the Elder later held against him as a crime against humanity. The mutilation at Uxellodunum was not rage, it was policy, a calculated brutality meant to end not just this siege, but the very idea of another one. And in that, it worked. Uxellodunum was effectively the last stand of the Great Gallic War. After that hilltop fell, organized resistance across Gaul was finished. Caesar spent the following winter at Nemetocena, governing gently, honoring chiefs, lowering burdens. The open hand shone immediately after the iron one, and when he marched his legions out of Gaul into the Roman civil war, the country he left behind stayed quiet. It would remain Roman for roughly 500 years, long enough that the language spoken on that ground today is a daughter of Latin, not of Gaulish. Here is the wrinkle worth sitting with. We built up the two Gallic commanders, Draps and Lucterius, as the men who chose this ground and made this stand. But their story ends before the water does. Draps, captured in the fight over the grain convoy, refused all food in Roman captivity and starved himself to death. A last act of defiance from a man who had spent the war living off other people's supply lines. Lucterius, who fled when he was cut off from the town, wandered as a fugitive until a fellow Gaul, an Arvernian chief named Episnactus, whom Hirtius pointedly describes as a great friend of the Roman people, put him in chains and handed him over to Caesar. The men who chose the hill did not command it at the end. The defenders who watched their spring die and read it as the anger of the gods were, in a sense, holding a position their leaders had already lost or abandoned. And the stand itself was fought for a cause that no longer existed, because the War of Uxellodunum had really ended a year before, on the field at Alesia, when Vercingetorix laid down his arms. These men were defending a country that was already gone, and that brings the whole thing full circle, back to the water. The reason Uxellodunum still matters, and the reason it is worth 20 minutes of your attention 2,000 years later, is not the cruelty at the end, and not even the courage of the defense. It is the shape of the idea. A spring seems like the most permanent thing in a landscape. It is why people build cities on top of them, why the Gauls hung offerings beside them, why every culture on earth has told stories about waters that never fail. It feels like water coming from the gods, given freely, impossible to steal. Caesar's engineers refused to accept that. They understood that the spring was only the visible end of a hidden system, that the water had to come from somewhere, that it ran in channels through the fractured limestone from a catchment no one worshipped and no one guarded, and that anything with a source can be cut off at that source if you are patient enough to find it. They did not fight the water where it was strong, at the surface, where the defenders were waiting, and where the fight had already been proven unwinnable. They reached back into the hill, found it where it was hidden and undefended, and turned it away. It is the same insight that built the aqueducts and drained the mines, pointed for one summer at a single hillside in Gaul. They defeated a city not by taking what it had, but by understanding where it came from. That is the lesson the men on the walls never got to learn, because by the time they understood what the silence of the spring actually meant, the tunnels were already dug, the veins were already cut, and the water that had defined their fortress was already flowing, quietly, into Roman ditches at the bottom of the hill. If you found this worth your time, consider subscribing. There are a great many sieges like this one, decided not by the sword but by an idea nobody on the losing side saw coming, and I would like to keep telling them.